Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways to address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is responding to adjustments. Change initiatives typically involve continual revisions. New information emerges, stakeholder needs shift, and requirements change. Many people dive into accommodating the changes without assessing whether they help or hinder the projects or their success. Reacting quickly and taking action can be more important than assessing the alterations and determining the best response. So, how do you respond to plan adjustments that accommodate necessary changes and keep resources focused on delivering your defined outcomes? Our guest today is Laura Oliver. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on. It's great to see you. Laura has 9 years of change management and business systems experience. She is currently senior consultant at Deloitte and volunteer president at Grindstone Award Foundation, where she leads a board of directors to achieve its mission of providing financial assistance to female hockey players who are unable to play due to financial reasons. Laura holds a Bachelor of Business Administration at the Goodman School of Business, Brock University. Laura, what's been your experience with responding to adjustments to your initiatives and to your plans?
Well, Phil, I'll just start out by saying, who hasn't been on a project that's needed to adjust at some point, whether it be scope or resources or timing? I almost feel like you have to go into a project with the assumption that things are going to change at some point, and you have to be agile and you have to be ready to pivot.
It's a great point, and it's a great assumption going in, but I didn't have that. I had the fallacy that it had to be perfect, the pressure on me and the team to make it bulletproof, which we know isn't true. Why do you think we fall into, or some people fall into, that perfection mindset when we know that there's going to be changes?
I think it's the idea of going in and just being able to give the client or the people involved in the project the best experience possible. And of course, we know in change that the best experience possible is the least disruption. So we want to go in and provide that experience and be right from the get-go. But that's not possible. We've all gone through 2 years of a pandemic. We know that we have to be willing to change, be willing to go off course a little bit. And I think we have to make that okay within our project teams right from the start. Make it okay to talk about adjusting. Celebrate when teams have changed their plans quickly for a client.
So true. What I'm thinking about now is if we could do that, and then when the change happens, then it's seen as normal and potentially even good, that we're responding to the market quickly, and that's why we're nimble and that's why we're changing. But so often I find in organizations, they're led by their existing cultures, whatever that culture is. And for them, it's right and can be through the spectrum of command and control to egalitarian or whatever it is. How do you accommodate that realization that we are going to change where maybe the culture of the organization isn't as aligned in their day-to-day operations?
Setting that expectation from the beginning, that we're coming to the table with a team that is willing to adjust if anything happens along the way, and using it as an opportunity rather than a setback to recraft your plans, to add improvements that you may not have been able to before. I think when there's an adjustment needing to be made, a team can take the opportunity to recraft their plans, look ahead, and find out if there's anything that they can improve upon that maybe they didn't have the chance to before. We make an assumption that, okay, if there's been a change to scope or there's been a change to timeline, that this is a negative thing, and it really doesn't need to be. And so starting that conversation with the client early, that our team is coming to the table ready with a plan now, and if there needs to be an adjustment in the future, we will be ready to adjust or pivot our plans when that happens. And the key there is when, because we know plans are going to adjust. It's just how are we going to respond to that adjustment?
Oh, that's so wise. A lot of the change work that we do, it's all based on expectations. So if we're aligned with our expectations, things usually go well. And if they're not, then you get those knee-jerk reactions and all the things that distract resources and add risk to it. What are the typical changes or adjustments that you found in your career? Like, are there ones that just tend to come up? You'd mentioned a few at the beginning, but what are the ones that you're almost anticipating because it's a here we go again, because this is just the way change works?
I would say definitely scope and definitely timeline. Those are two that I see come across on every project, especially when it comes to a change team. When you're working in OCM, Phil, you may have seen this before. Every task goes to change. The change team has to cover it all, especially when it comes to scope. The scope can definitely creep a little bit. And so the change team has to bring on those new tasks, adjust our plan, and then, of course, timeline. And how many timelines have had to adjust? Clients who were ready to go live right as the pandemic started, and it just didn't make sense for their people and their companies at that time to go live, and things had to get pushed, or the team isn't fully ready to go live at that point, and it just makes the most sense to postpone for whatever reason that may be. So those are definitely the two that I see the most often. Another one that does come in frequently is resourcing. How many times you get very excited about somebody new joining your team, and they're all excited, and you think this is going to be such a great asset to our team. This person's great. And you find out 6 months in that they've been pulled to another assignment, or you find out that somebody has got multiple things on their plate and they're not able to fully engage with your project. So scope, timeline, resources, definitely the big three. And for technology implementations, you see a lot of user needs changing. How many times you've done a full change impact analysis? You think you're so solid on what the changes are. You have a great change strategy, and then you learn that your client wants to add a new module. Okay, well, back to the drawing board. What does that mean for the users involved? So being ready to adjust that way is always important as well.
What are the challenges when those happen? Because those are big changes. It is going back to the drawing board, reframing, reskewing, whatever. What are the challenges that you find as a senior leader in change? All of a sudden this comes and the scope has changed. What are the things that you have to overcome?
What makes it challenging is sometimes you don't know all of the people involved, the project team members involved, and how they feel about the adjustment. So that's one of the things that I've come across in being a new consultant at Deloitte is I come from 8 years of working on internal projects. I knew all of the people involved, the key players. I knew what made them tick. I knew the culture. I knew the systems and the processes. But when you're working as an external consultant, you don't always have that liberty, and you have to really dig deep and get to know who those key players are. What's the culture like? You have to invest in those relationships so that you really understand what's changing and what the impacts are on your client as a whole. That's really important when you're trying to figure out what that means when something changes.
That's so good. And I found the same too, it coming from an internal resource and then an external, and the power of relationships where it's Raj. And I know Raj, you started together 5 years ago, and there's just that connectivity that you have when we don't have history together. How do you go about establishing those relationships that will smooth the adjustment process?
That's a really good question, Phil. I immediately go into I want to learn more mode. I start to message the project team members who may know more about what this could mean at a project or a program level. I start to message any users that I may know. So subject matter experts or super users, if this is a technology implementation, really get to know who they are as people and what this means to them, and get their ideas of how this impacts the rest of their organization, because they're the ones who know, they know their people. And so I think it really is worth taking the time to dive in and really understand your client and their culture, because ultimately that's going to help build a better plan and a better way to adjust going forward, because you'll have that insider information about what this truly means to the stakeholders who are impacted.
That's great. And when you have those relationships going through, it just makes the next one easier. And are there any other differences between the internal and external team member? Can be quite different, but then there's so many similarities. Anything else that you notice when you're dealing with adjustments? Or
one of the things that comes to mind is with internal, I feel like when you know the people so well, you can come back to your company, and if there's an adjustment that's being proposed, you can say, based on all of my experience here, I don't think that that's the best way to proceed. When you're working with an external consultant, you don't have that background. And so when you come to the table with a proposal, you really have to have done your research, the business context and the reason for the change. You have to come in with your experience, of course, and make a proposal and try to act on behalf of the client as best as you can. But sometimes as an external consultant, you really have to be responsive to how the client wants to proceed.
Just wondering, it might have been earlier in your career, maybe this hasn't happened, but it's definitely happened to me where I didn't take the high road when an adjustment came in and I just had a knee-jerk response and did it. Time is of the essence. And I did, just like my opening comments, I jumped into being efficient and tactical in managing it versus being strategic about considering what was being asked of me. Have you ever had that experience? And if you have, what was the impact of the knee-jerk from a story or experience that you've had?
I've had the opportunity to contribute to the conversation when there's needed to be a quick response. So what I've done is really worked with my team to understand what are all the options ahead of us. So instead of making a knee-jerk reaction, is take the time as a team, come up with a couple different proposals that you can then involve the client in the decision. Because we all know in change, everybody just wants to feel included. So I find if you go forward and you've made a decision and maybe haven't got the blessing of everyone to date, you could be stepping into some boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. And so my advice would be, instead of making a knee-jerk reaction, take the time to work with your team to come up with a couple different proposals, which then you can put forward for your client.
Oh, that's great advice. If someone's involved and they've had some sort of an input, all of a sudden you're on the same side of the table. Whereas if they don't know, or they're shocked, or they don't feel that they've had their input, there's a natural resistance to moving forward. Have you had that experience in your past?
Absolutely, I have. And it could just be even not including a subject matter expert entirely in creating a new process or involving them in a communication. And that's always been on my checklist of items that need to be done before any communication goes out or any team meeting has been had, is I go back to make sure that I've involved everybody that should be involved. Because it's one of those really easy check the box items that will really save you a lot of grief later on. And you just know you've involved all the right people, and you don't have to worry about who are you missing and what potential issues could arise in the future.
And sort of on that vein of making sure people are included and up to date, let's say an adjustment happens and now it's time to communicate out what that is. Any advice or any experience that you've had? Okay, now we've made the adjustment. Maybe the inner team knows, or maybe it's the PMO knows, but the broader organization doesn't know. How do you go about that? And, one is how do you communicate? And two is perhaps how do you communicate well so that the message lands?
I step into 5W mode. When a communication needs to go out, I try to figure out who needs to know what, when do they need to know it, and essentially trying to be as crisp and complete in the communication as possible. The worst thing that could happen is you send out a communication and it causes more confusion than you intended. So I would put a lot of focus into reviewing that communication, send it to people in your close group to review it, to look out for things that you may not see before you deliver that announcement, because you don't want to deliver an announcement that's confusing and may not actually give the stakeholders a complete view of what you're trying to tell them. And so I really recommend spending time on those communications and mapping out what do they need to hear from you about this change.
Oh, certainly. And is there a thought about the different stakeholders and the different messages too? Or do you just go into like, here's a standard, here's the communication out?
Absolutely. You have to think about all the stakeholders involved, and different people at different levels of the organization, different roles in the project, all have different messages that they need to receive from you. And so the message could look different for every stakeholder that you need to communicate to. One of the things that I always try to do is map out exactly who needs to hear what and what are the key messages that those people need to hear from you. And it could end up being 10 different communications, all delivering the same message, but said differently. And if that's what needs to happen in order for people to receive the information correctly and to avoid any confusion, that's the best way to go.
Oh, absolutely. And it reminds me of a mistake I made where I'd done my stakeholder analysis. What happened is the announcement went out, and it was with a large sales team. The announcement went out to the impacted groups and any stakeholders that had a part to play within this route to market change. And the announcement went out, and all of a sudden this other leader from sales that was not impacted, really frustrated and really angry, and said, well, why didn't you include me? And I said, there's really nothing that was going to impact your team. And what he said is, yeah, but my whole team heard about it through their friends. And they came to me and asked me for my view, and I didn't even know it was there. And it was such a huge blind spot. And I said, you're right. And I apologize. And I've never forgotten that. How do you make sure you connect everybody? Because it is an ecosystem in our organization, so that even if they're not impacted culturally in a way, they are.
Well, first of all, I think your response in acknowledging this person and saying, hey, I'm so sorry that you were missed in this communication. We should have involved you from the get-go is completely the way to go. I think that's all you can do. When you're on a project that's so large, sometimes you can miss someone, you can miss a stakeholder. I think when that happens, you need to acknowledge it. You need to add them to your list. You need to make sure that they are involved going forward. Acknowledge your mistake. And I think that there's something to learn in how we go about stakeholder analysis in the future, is not necessarily driving after those that are directly impacted, but looking at those who are directly impacted and who they report to, who are their connections, who are their networks, and how would they receive the information if they didn't receive it from you directly, Phil? What if they received it from the project as opposed to hearing it firsthand?
One thing I hadn't considered, and I think it's really profound about the networks. We live and coexist in networks. And so often I don't think we dig deeply into, well, what are the networks versus the org chart? Have you ever had something where the most senior person picks an option before going through evaluation and fact-based development, and they pick one for whatever reason? They say, we're going left and we're going to do this. And they mandate, or they're about to mandate something that from your perhaps greater knowledge isn't the best, and it's going to increase a lot of risk. Have you ever had an experience like that? And if you had, how do you address that? Because you've got the energy of we're going left, and how do you influence someone who has authority that might not be the best for the project or even the organization?
That's a really tough one. In change, at least my perspective, the way that I go about change management is in a very proactive way. I love planning. I will always encourage people to plan ahead. What is your vision? What is your strategy for the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years ahead? And so when someone makes a decision that may not be what you feel isn't the best decision at that time, you have to slip into a reactive mode. And sometimes that can be a bit uncomfortable, and sometimes can be uncomfortable for me because it's not my style of working. I want to be proactive. So I think in those situations, you have to go with the flow and you have to be agile. And I know that sounds like a very informal response, but it's true. You have to be agile. You have to be willing to adjust your plan. And you can do your best as a consultant or with your consulting team to go back to the client or the person or team that's put forward this adjustment or this change and say, this is why we think that a different way would be better, or whatever the context may be. At some point, you have to be willing to adjust yourself and trust in the fact that the decision that was made for a reason. And so you have to adjust your plans going forward. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. You yourself may not think it's the best option for your client, but again, trusting that the decision was made for a good reason with good intent.
What I found is if you can present information that might be contrary or given a broader perspective, and they still say, nope, this is what we're doing. And then it's about how do we activate and make it successful and move forward. You made a point earlier about not all adjustments are bad. And in fact, many of them are good. And from an agile mindset, we should be changing them. How do you build the positive as much as you can or leverage it when there is something that's good? And it could be more time, it could be more resources, whatever it is, but it's perceived as a positive. How do you amplify that to get the full value of, hey, this is really good news?
I think you have to be ready, though, for when an announcement is made, a change needs to happen. Although we may see it as a positive change from the project perspective, it may not be perceived as a positive change from the project team, from the users, from anybody that's going through the change themselves. So I think that's where the change team has to pivot into the communications plan. Okay, what are the new messages that we're going to start to install here? And what are the positives that we really want to enforce about this change? Okay, well, the timeline has been pushed out. Yes, that really sucks for everybody that's been on this project for 4 years already. But you know what? This is going to give us a lot of extra time for training. People are going to feel more equipped and ready for the change. And you start to put those little messages into your everyday meetings with these people. And slowly over time, if you've done it well, you'll see that people will come around. But what I've seen is that at first you have to be prepared that people won't see the adjustment as positive as you may right off the start.
I'd love to switch gears into the leadership mode of managing these adjustments. And if we could talk about your great presidentship of Grindstone, it just sounds like a tremendous organization. Do you have any comments about the types of adjustments that you have to make, whether your annual plan or your different projects that you're doing? What are the typical things that you have within a not-for-profit environment?
Yeah, Phil, there's not a whole lot of difference. I face the same challenges when working with my executive team and the board all the time. In a volunteer organization, we have challenges such as everybody's volunteer. So we have to be ready for people to have other commitments on the side of volunteering with Grindstone. So that happens a lot where we full stride, full speed ahead on a project, and unfortunately something's come up and we have to be ready for that. And the reason why I say that I don't find it a whole lot different in terms of making adjustments with Grindstone versus making adjustments with my clients at Deloitte is that we're facing the same challenges. Scope, resources, timing, they all come into play. And I think that my advice for how you tackle adjustments is the exact same. Plan, plan, plan. Be agile. If something happens and you can't work on a certain aspect of the project currently because something has changed, okay, well, what's the next thing that you're going to work on? What are you focusing on for the next year ahead, the next 2 and 3 years ahead? And I know that sounds so far out, but that's really how you can adjust quickly, is knowing what you're going to next and what can you hop into if something comes up and you can't continue that for the time being.
Great points about projects or initiatives, regardless of the structure. And you're the lead. Any advice for the leader?
My advice is to be really clear on your vision and communicate it well to your team. And I think as long as you do that, your team will be able to adjust effectively. And that's what I've been doing at Grindstone is every board meeting, we talk about our vision, which doesn't change. It's the same thing, of course. And so as long as we're communicating our vision consistently and working on our strategy and making sure that everybody's aligned to the strategy and saying, hey, something may come up and that's okay, but here are our goals for the year. This is what we're all marching toward, whether it's in a nonprofit or you're working with a client, the same principles apply. So being really crisp and clear about your vision as a leader and acting on behalf of your organization and not shifting from that vision, even if the really bright and shiny things come along, that's where you can get that respect from your team of, okay, the executive team knows what they're doing, or the project team knows what they're doing. They're all marching towards the same goal. And I know my part of it, and I'm willing to adjust as needed, but ultimately we're all going towards the same end goal.
Oh, that's so great. And especially in not-for-profits where you have an inspiring mission, people are volunteering because they care and everyone has that aligned goal. So it does seem to be a rallying cry. Are there any other differences or are there any differences with the working with everyone being a volunteer on the changes that happen? Or is it pretty well the same thing as if you were in a for-profit organization?
One of the major differences that I see is that when you're working on a project with people who work for that organization and are paid to participate in this project, they have accountabilities to fulfill their responsibilities on the project team. You assume that they are gung-ho, they are ready for the change. That's not always what you get. In a non-for-profit, what you do have are people who are so passionate about the cause, who just want to help, though they don't have to be accountable to the nonprofit. They are different. Certainly. And no one is better than the other. They're just different, especially the people side of change.
It is a different orientation, but we're all people. So there's so many similarities as well. I'm just wondering, sort of broadly across all different projects and types of organizations, are there any watchouts for listeners, things to avoid or things to be cautious about as they address the alterations that we know just happens naturally?
And this may not be a watch out per se, but one of the things that I would encourage people to do is to be proactive and to think ahead to what your client may ask you in the future, whether it be a question, Where is this plan at? How is the timeline coming along? How are your deliverables coming along? And almost anticipating what your client will ask for will really help you because you'll have something ready quicker. It's not that you're starting from scratch. I always try to make templates in advance, make communications in advance so that when they are needed, so you just have to pick it up, dust it off, edit it a little bit, and off you go. So it's not really a watch out, more of a encouragement to be proactive and be ready for what could be asked or expected of you.
That's such great advice. And I found when I haven't done that, it's the question that you didn't anticipate. You hadn't even gone there. This is a whole new thing I'm trying to figure it out. And typically my emotions would take over. So what's in my head is saying, I don't know the answer, or what do I respond to? Look intelligent, whatever it is. But it's all those human things that you have instead of saying it's responding with clarity, but also with calmness too, and confidence.
Yeah, and I think that's the theme of our whole conversation here, Phil, is being ready, being proactive, get ahead on planning so that if adjustments are needed, you're ready to respond.
Absolutely. Would you extend that even to your team too? Because you talked about the team is acting that way, not just you.
Exactly. Your whole team needs to be agile. And I think that's where those conversations can start from the beginning of the project with the team lead, with the project, is what are our ways of working together? What are we expecting? What is okay to talk about? What is the culture? And I think as long as from the beginning, adjustments are seen as okay, whether it be people leaving the project, people coming onto the project, timelines changing, as long as that is seen as okay, I think the team will talk about changes more openly and people will be more open to receiving the adjustments when they happen and more willing to help you if your plan needs to adjust and you need their help.
Oh, so that's great advice. Absolutely. We know that time is one of the biggest resources we could ever have. And often it's not the resource that we have the luxury of using that much of. And I'm just wondering, in the spirit of change on the run, maybe you're put onto a new assignment, adjustments are happening, you don't have a lot of time, you're hitting the ground running, and you just need to respond quickly. What would be the one thing that you would do that would give you the 80% results in the 20% of time because you must make an action quickly? What's the one thing that you would do?
I would plan. Think ahead, be proactive. If you have 10, 20 minutes available, look at your schedule. Where can you make improvements? How can you get ahead on something? I will always say that planning ahead will get you those results that you want in the future and help you be ready for any adjustments that are needed.
That's great. What I take too is taking the time to do it. It's almost being planful about planning. It's just scheduling it in because often it's too late if you haven't done it and you're in the midst of major adjustments.
It's funny because in our everyday lives, we always have a plan B. If you're buying a new car and it doesn't turn out to be what you want, well, what's the next car that you're going to buy? We always have a plan B in our lives and we're always readjusting for things that happen on a day-to-day basis, but we're a little bit more reluctant to pre-plan when we're working on projects. So I think we just need to make that more of a consistent practice. And I think it will help us be more ready for if adjustments come along.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And just as we close off the show, any one last point to make with the listeners or something that you think is really relevant? How do you manage that adjustment process?
So one of the things that I've come across in my 1 year of external consulting so far is when responding to adjustments and even proposing new things to the client is that whole concept of why not me? It can be scary. When the client is putting something in front of you, asking for a new deliverable, we want to add a new milestone to the project, and it can be very easy to get in your head about, well, what kind of proposal could I make? Like, how can I contribute to this problem or how can I make this better? And I think it's really taking a step back and just saying, why not me? Of course, I've got the experience to do this. I can do it. Let's put together something with the team and let's propose it to the client. And so I think I use that motto in everything that I do, whether it be with Grindstone, whether it be with Deloitte, with my clients. I always go in saying, why not me? If we all consider that we come to the table with value, with experience, everybody should be willing to listen to our proposals.
What great advice. Thank you so much. What a great way of framing it too. So thank you. And Laura, thanks so much for being on the Change on the Run podcast. I really appreciate your time. And how can people, first of all, get in contact with you? And then how can they learn more about Grindstone Award Foundation?
Thank you, Philip. Thank you so much for having me on the show. If people want to get in touch, I am on LinkedIn just as Laura Oliver. And if you want to hear more about Grindstone, you can go to www.grindstoneaward.com. We're always looking for donations, and we're looking to find more families that need help supporting their girls in hockey. So please reach out if you have any ideas to help them.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks again for being on the show. And thank you, everyone, for listening. If there's something that resonates with you from the conversation we've had today, why not test it with your change initiatives and see how it works for you? And until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.